Hello, and welcome to the Voice of the Washington Monthly, your source for policy, politics, and fresh ideas. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
Welcome to part 2 of our interview with Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly. Paul was a speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, who led Democrats to victory in 1992 after a long stretch of electoral defeats for the Democratic Party. This experience with Clinton was very much in the backdrop for Paul as he put together the most recent issue of the Washington Monthly. The cover package is titled 10 New Ideas for the Democratic Party to Help the Working Class and Itself. Please also listen to part 1, where we begin a conversation with Paul about the new ideas that he thinks would bring back the party's fortunes.
Well, let's pick up on that, Paul, and look at the question of what Democrats should be as we go forward and how we find ourselves in a different situation than we did in 2017. Of course, in the 2016 election, Trump eased his way into office, even though he lost the popular vote to Secretary Clinton, and it was the vagaries of the Electoral College that gave him the White House. Now we have a situation where Trump actually won the popular vote. Now, there's a perception that he scored some kind of smashing victory. You know, we all know that's not true, that he squeaked through. He did not win a majority of the popular vote, but he did get more votes than Vice President Harris, and he did get them in the right swing states that made all the difference. So it is certainly correct to assess this as a formidable political situation, even though narrow. There was a sense in 2017 that we're the resistance. This is a completely illegitimate interloping force that has come in and that we will rid ourselves of as soon as possible. 2025, we have the prospect of a good deal harder slog to get our politics on some reasonable footing. How do you see, somebody's said we need resistance 2.0. How do you see that, and what role can the monthly play?
Well, there's a lot in that question. Look, we can go down a path of discussing the potential damage that this new administration, the Trump administration, in its 2.0 version, can do to democratic norms and constitutional and our constitutional system. And I think I suppose you can exaggerate it. I do think there's a lot of resilience and redundancy that will make that difficult for him. And I think his administration is so at odds with itself about what it wants to do that should give us some hope that the constitutional order can survive it. But I don't want to minimize the danger of that. We are in uncharted territory. We could well be moving toward the system of government that you see in Hungary, that you see in Turkey, that you saw in Poland. Just to mention, one aspect of that, oligarchs buying up media, right, and aligning with the dominant power. This is what all the countries that I just mentioned, that's the system that they've created. We now see that happening with Elon Musk having purchased Twitter. Terrible economic investment for him, but a brilliant political investment. And all the major papers, with the exception of maybe the New York Times, feeling that they need to bow and scrape before Donald Trump and give contributions to his inauguration. It's a very scary time. That said, there is a limit to what average citizens and Democratic elected officials and Republicans who, are brave enough to go against it. There's a limit to what they can do in terms of resistance. They should fight like heck, but there's a limit. A perhaps better way forward is good old solid politics. A lot of what Donald Trump and the Republicans want to do is deeply unpopular. He did not win a sweeping mandate for massive change. He won because predominantly working class people whose lives have frankly sucked for decades and were hit with inflation that was very painful for them, thought, well, at least this guy's going to shake things up. I'm for that. And they knew full well, at least a lot of them did, that he's a liar and a criminal. And they voted for him anyway, not because he's a liar and a criminal, not because he's an authoritarian, but because they don't believe that the institutions that are out there now are working to their benefit. So Donald Trump and his party are going to push policies that are not helpful nor popular, not just with liberals like Democrats, but with many members of his own party. And let me give you one example, and this is another story that's in the current issue of the Washington Monthly. It's called "Tutorize, Don't Privatize Public Education." Now, the basis of this story is the very high likelihood that Donald Trump and his Department of Education are going to push for legislation and regulations that allow public school dollars tax dollars currently going into public schools, to be diverted to private and religious schools. States, conservative red states all over the country, have been doing this in recent years. It's a different idea than the old voucher idea, which tended predominantly to be for students in low-income neighborhoods. This is the policy in which anybody, regardless of their income, can take tax dollars going to the public schools and use them to put their kids in private and religious schools. It's terrible policy just on the merits. There's no evidence that it improves school quality. A lot of evidence that it is used predominantly by the affluent, and it drains public schools of dollars that they need to provide education. There's also evidence that it's deeply unpopular with Republican voters. In 2024, there were several ballot initiatives in places like Colorado and Nebraska and I believe Kentucky, where red state voters overwhelmingly voted down the similar ideas of expanding money for private schools. Nevertheless, there's every indication that the Trump administration is going to push it. Democrats ought to uniformly oppose that legislation. I think if they do, they'll be successful, and it'll be a wound to the Republicans and Donald Trump. They're going to have their hat handed to them. Remember what happened to George W. Bush when he tried to do something similar to Social Security by creating private accounts. His support in the public collapsed, and it went down 10% in public opinion polls and never recovered. I think the same could happen here. But what the Democrats also need is a plan to do something about public schools, which a lot of people think, and rightly so, are not up to the task, especially in the post-COVID environment. Students' levels of achievement collapsed during COVID. They've never really come back. And short of being in favor of whatever the teachers' unions want, which is typically things like higher pay for teachers, God bless them, but that's no evidence that that's going to improve the quality of teaching. The Democrats have no plan. We do. The Washington Monthly has put forth the idea that providing tutoring to every student who needs it is probably the single most effective intervention that we know of. And we know that this is probably true because under Joe Biden, with the American Rescue Plan, his big stimulus in 2021, $7.5 billion of federal dollars went to schools to do what they call high impact tutoring, allow students to usually get some in-house but often online tutoring, and it added 6 months or a year to students' math and reading scores. This is an idea that even red state governors have embraced, but that Republicans themselves show no sign of being willing to support because it happened under Biden. That's a great idea for Democrats to embrace. So some combination then of old-fashioned resistance, use your considerable votes in the House and the Senate to block things you don't agree with, but also offer an alternative. That to me is the smarter way for Democrats to behave and strategize over the next few years.
So Paul, you have this slate of wonderful ideas, and I'm wondering if you have a particular person in mind as a messenger to carry it forward. One of the things we learned from the Trump era, if nothing else, is that the messenger often matters just as much as the message. And, where Democrats have kind of fallen short is on that emotional connection, perhaps with the working class. I mean, Bill Clinton was Bubba. He was that persona. He got it. He connected, and that was a big part of why he won. So, who do you see as someone who could replicate that kind of success, that visceral connection with ordinary people? Who do you see as the new standard bearers that you're most excited about?
That is a great question, and I wish I had a good answer for you. Bill Clinton was a once in a century political talent, except actually we got two in a century because we got Barack Obama. And the two of them had a few unique qualities. One of them was the capacity to get across complicated policy ideas to the mass of Americans in ways that made them clear enough that they could understand the essence of it. The world's complicated. People know the world's complicated. We all deal with complexity every day. We know government's complicated. People don't have time. I mean, the listeners of this podcast, the readers of the Washington Monthly, are the rare individuals that spend the time to learn. But average people can learn just fine. If you take the time and have the care and the talent to explain what you're doing with the power the public gave you. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama had that skill. We really haven't had on the Democratic side anyone with that level of skill. Maybe Pete Buttigieg. And it's not just a skill of communicating. It's the capacity to absorb, understand, and put ideas, policy ideas, in a larger context, a vision, to use a $10 word or a biblical word, really. Absent vision, absent a larger sense of where you're taking the country, the policies are just a kind of technocracy that don't matter. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama had vision. I'm not sure Donald Trump has vision, but he sure got policies, and he's sure able to boil them down in simple ways that resonate and make sense. Build a wall. Get rid of the illegals. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to get these across. And so the idea that policy doesn't matter, I think, is ridiculous. We know policy hurt the Democrats, things like trans and defund the police and open borders. Democrats were still smarting from that stuff 4 years after most of them abandoned those ideas. And, great communicators, go back to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan won on the strength of ideas like vastly expanding the military and major cuts in government, and that were extreme even within his own party a few years before he won in 1980. So ideas and vision really matter. I don't know which of the potential Democratic candidates this takes a kind of entrepreneurship of political talent, and there's a lot of political talent in the Democratic Party. Josh Shapiro, I mentioned Pete Buttigieg. Kamala Harris is an extraordinary political talent. What she didn't show in this race, and perhaps it's because she came in so late, what she didn't do is show a new vision. And Joe Biden, bless him, put in place a new vision, but could never explain it. And I think was almost afraid to explain it, afraid he would be offending one part or another of the Democratic coalition. And if there's anything that Democrats need to do is find new ideas that bring the different parts of the coalition together. Look, we have young, progressive, educated people who, over the last 4 years, have thought that the most important thing government needs to do is protect the rights of undocumented aliens and trans folks and combat police brutality. Those were their issues. That's what they stood with. And, fine, but that was not the issues that most working class people wanted addressed, and in fact, they found it almost counter to their interests. At the same time, we have affluent, college-educated folks in the Democratic Party, especially at the upper echelons of the tech and financial sectors, who were very, very worried about Joe Biden's economic populist ideas. the antitrust, and so forth. Both Biden and Harris were so afraid of offending any of those groups that they spoke in a kind of pablum, and the public wasn't given a sense of vision. So whoever this new person is has to find a way through it. And I do believe that it begins with the ideas.
Well, I think that this may lead us into a forest where we don't need to go. But the late Charlie Peters of blessed memory wanted to have the monthly embody a philosophy that he called neoliberalism. Now it's pretty important to note that that term got taken in a whole different direction.
Yes.
And we do not want to be the neoliberal magazine within those terms. How about it, Paul? How about giving us a name? How about giving us, a motto, a flag, Excelsior, up the hill?
I do not like the term neoliberal for precisely the reason, Garrett, that you said. First of all, it's an imported word that was invented in England and in Europe to describe a kind of market Thatcherite market fundamentalism, the policies of privatization and deregulation that Margaret Thatcher brought to the UK. And Charlie was never a privatizer. The Washington Monthly under Charlie Peters, my predecessor, never believed in privatizing government services. It was a staunch defender of most, if not all, regulations. Nobody, the only magazine that I know of, the only publication that I know of that put on its cover a story opposing the deregulation of credit default swaps and some of the other things that led to that directly to the housing crisis and the Great Recession was the Washington Monthly. And yet the term that Charlie came up with, neoliberalism, did define those policies at the time. And as I said, I didn't agree with everything Charlie wrote at the time. Charlie wanted to take 50% of all civil service jobs and make them political appointees. He thought that would lead to a more responsive government and more people with knowledge of the federal government. I didn't agree with it then. I don't agree with it now, and I don't agree with Donald Trump doing it. But in general, Charlie and the Monthly provided fresh insights into policy and the workings of government that ultimately found their way into the policies of Bill Clinton. When I was a young editor here in the 80s, we published a story on school reform and got a letter from Bill Clinton saying, "I liked your story on school reform." He was then the governor. "But, my wife Hillary's done a lot on school reform and you didn't mention it." And that's how carefully Bill Clinton read the Monthly. And I hope there's some talent out there in both parties that are reading our stuff and absorbing it. And somebody with greater talent than any of us can use these as tools to shape a politics that can get us out of our mess.
Paul, thank you so much for this preview of this incredibly important issue of the Washington Monthly. Thank you for the incredible slate of ideas that the team has come up with, and hopefully we'll find that standard bearer soon.
Yeah, let's hope. Well, thank you for having me on. It's been great fun. Love the show, and keep at it. We need this. We need these kinds of discussions because there's very few places in the podcast world where you get this level of discussion of policy itself. A lot of politics, but not a lot of substance. So thank you for what you're doing.
Take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.